We all have our vices, and it seems most of us are willing to pay for them, whatever the cost. So how bad can that be?
The harm is both externally, passive smoking, drunk driving, these kind of things, and also to the individual themselves and to the health costs that they create when they are sick. And those often fall on society. So that's the general motivation behind these things.
In today's episode, we look at sin taxes with my former colleague, Christoph Rosenberg.
I retired from the IMF about 2 years ago after 32 years there, of which the last 10 years as Deputy Director of the Communications Department. And among many other things there, I also oversaw the introduction of this very podcast series with you, Bruce. And so it's particularly exciting to be for the first time here on this podcast. Thank you very much for having me.
Christoph, it's great to have you. And I've been for years wanting to do a podcast with you, so here we are.
Here we are. I kind of did full circle to the things that I did when I was doing my PhD in economics, where I was dealing with value-added taxes in the European Union. And so this is, again, a tax-related issue, finally.
Okay, that's great. So you've written an article, interesting article for Finance and Development magazine, and you rightly start the article with the saying, and we often hear about death and taxes, as being those two things no one can avoid. But put in the context of this article, it seems getting better at the latter, or taxes, can possibly delay the former, no?
Yes.
So how does that work?
Yeah, well, obviously it was a play of words of old Benjamin Franklin. I'm very sure that old Ben did not think of taxes as a way to curtail the smoking of tobacco in the clay pipes they had, or of drinking brandy. Okay. But it is true that taxes have become one of several pieces in the toolkit to address the health impact of what we typically call sin products.
Right.
And, for simplicity here, it's just the three: tobacco, alcohol, and sugar. So as we know, there has been a lot of effort over the last few years to reduce the consumption of these products through regulation. I think societal changes have also played a role, and there's certainly a more consciousness in this area. Yeah. And taxes play a role in this as well.
But to what extent do taxes play a role in it? I mean, how much taxes do countries generally make from these sin taxes?
So actually not a whole lot. No. Maybe 1% of GDP, maybe a little more. So it, of course, does not compare at all to the income taxes or the value-added taxes that most countries use for their revenue purposes. But they have been an old favorite of governments. Actually, you can go back to 2400 before Christ, where the Egyptians imposed a tax on beer. But these taxes have always been imposed because it was very easy to collect taxes at the source from these kind of products. And that's why they also have persevered for a long time.
And yet people can continue to drink and smoke. What do we know about the effectiveness of these taxes when it comes to changing people's behaviors?
It's very difficult to establish the causality. As I mentioned, there's also regulations, smoking bans, age limits. So there are these societal trends. But just looking at the numbers, I think it's not far-fetched to think that, for example, in the area of tobacco, which is the one that is most of these sin taxes, the one that is most used, there has been some effect. If you look, the tax on a pack of cigarettes has massively increased over the last decades, and the degree of smoking has massively declined. The smoking prevalence has declined from about over 30% to globally to now 20%. In the US, it used to be around 40%. 40% of people used to smoke in the US in the 60s, and now for the first time it seems to be below 10%. So I think it's reasonable to assume that taxes have played a role
in changing people's behaviors,
in contributing to the change in people's behavior. One interesting little example is New Zealand, which had a very deliberate strategy to wean people off smoking cigarettes. Cigarettes are particularly harmful, of course, so they decided in 2012 to gradually increase the tax on cigarettes.
Yeah, like
But
most countries have.
Like
actually.
most countries have. But, of course, people just don't stop smoking. If the
It's an
tax is
addiction.
so high, they go to illicit alternatives. So the New Zealanders introduced a deliberate strategy to wean people off smoking cigarettes, but to kind of nudge them towards smoking things that are less harmful, like e-cigarettes.
Right.
So they increased the tax differential between the smoked cigarettes and the vaping products. And that strategy seems to have worked. I mean, in this 15 years, the smoking cigarettes prevalence has declined from 18 to 8%. And the e-cigarette consumption has, of course, increased to, I think, now 14%. But they consider this to have been broadly a successful strategy, and many other countries are trying the same.
Yeah, what you're saying is these taxes are somewhat effective. So as they change people's behaviors, the products are also designed to adapt to the new world.
Yeah.
You go from cigarette tobacco to e-cigarettes. How, like in terms of tax policy, would they have made more money on tobacco than they are on e-cigarettes, for example?
Yeah, well, abstracting from the revenue perspective, which I'm sure we'll get to, I think that the general principle that we certainly advocate in the article that I wrote with my co-author Marius van Oort is that the taxation of products should be proportional to the harm they cause.
Okay.
So if you take a cigarette, a traditional cigarette or cigar, of course, it's much more harmful than to go to the other end of the spectrum, a nicotine patch, or something in the middle, which is an e-cigarette. So you should broadly align the harmfulness to the tax level. The difficulty is that the harmfulness is not that easy to exactly determine. Of course, there are a lot of medical studies. You can measure the toxicant that's in something, but the harmfulness also depends on how you consume it. I mean, how often do you smoke, or how deeply do you inhale, or for these new products that don't burn the tobacco but only heat it, that apparently is less harmful. So you have to calibrate the tax to what we know, and that's not super exact science. But I think the general principle holds: the higher the harm, or the presumed harm, the higher the tax.
So is it really about revenues, or is it more about governments trying to improve the health of its citizenry?
Well, as I mentioned, in earlier days, it was always the revenue perspective.
Right.
And, you can see that from many different examples. One I particularly like is from my own country, Germany, which introduced in 1902 a tax on sparkling wine to finance the buildup of the Imperial Navy.
Wow.
And this tax exists until today. It shows you that once these taxes are in place, they stay, because they're a very convenient revenue source. There are usually not that many producers of these products. You can tax them at the source. They're an easy tax base in that sense. But over the last few years, thanks also to the WHO and others, there's been much more consciousness that these are also a way of steering people away from unhealthy behaviors. And there certainly is a lot of, budget revenue potential, especially for developing countries, as now, aid budgets are drying up. But, as you can tell, I mean, there is an inherent conflict between these two goals. The more you dissuade people from smoking something, the less taxes you get in. So you have to calibrate your taxes to achieve both of those objectives.
So you touched upon this a little earlier, but if you heavily tax these products, smokers and drinkers will find them in other countries or on the black market. So is there any data that suggests that sin taxes increase illicit trade of these products?
Yeah, I think there's ample evidence, and that has been established over many, many, many years, because obviously people will find other ways, and the higher the tax, the more the incentive to do so is. For example, when Finland in 2004 lowered its alcohol tax, the sales of alcoholic products in its neighboring regions to Sweden, where the tax was still high, increased by 150%.
Right.
And there are some studies, more recent studies, I think, from the EU that show that the cross-border alcohol purchases are 1.4 billion liters.
Wow.
That's a tax loss of 4 billion. So clearly, this is going on, and not only in the EU where there are no border controls, but anywhere. And of course, police action or border action to stop this can help. But ultimately, what will address it is if the tax rates across countries are similar.
So in terms of what is taxed and what isn't, your article brings up some interesting examples of how dysfunctional these tax schemes can sometimes become, especially when it comes to taxing locally produced products at a much lower rate, regardless of how harmful they are. And your examples are beer in South Africa and cigarettes in India. Walk us through that. How does that work?
Yeah, no, I think, as I said, one principle should be you should tax according to the harm generated by the product.
Right.
Another is that you shouldn't leave any products out. And that kind of thing does happen a lot, and this happens especially in developing countries out of tradition. I mentioned the bidis in India.
Yeah.
Everybody knows those made from tobacco leaves. They're taxed much, much lower than regular cigarettes. And
yet very harmful. Right?
Yes, and very harmful. Or my favorite example is khat, which is this tobacco leaf that people chew in Ethiopia, which is really harmful in many different ways. And it's not taxed at all. So there are plenty of these examples. They're often justified as, this is our tradition, it supports local production, or often it's said that it helps the poorer people because they're the primary consumers of this. And that may all be true, but they fundamentally send the wrong signal. They send a signal that somehow this is less harmful than other products, even though the opposite may be true. They create the wrong investment incentives, and in the end, they don't help the poor. So I don't think they're really justified.
So there is one thing that you don't really delve into in your article that I would like to ask you about, and that is corporate influence in policymaking on these products. I guess it's probably more an advanced economy thing, and especially in the United States, corporations that produce these products have a lot of influence in policy. So how do governments manage to sort of balance the revenues from taxing these products without putting the companies that are making these products out of business?
Well, obviously, no company wants to be taxed on its product, but I think on the whole, they have all accepted that these products are taxed. My sense is there are two things that these corporations are focused on. One is equal treatment. They really don't like it that, they're taxed in one country but not in the other, or they don't like it that some products are taxed and others are not taxed. And I think there's some justification for that because from an economic perspective, there are also inefficiencies there. And the other thing that they all want is long-term planning certainty. So they want to know, what is my tax going to be this year, next year, 5 years, 10 years from now, so that they can adjust their production. And I think what, as I said, is already happening is that some of these products, these newer products, are taxed lower, has led to also adjustment on the production side. For example, in Germany, already now almost 10% of beer breweries' output is non-alcoholic beer. And, as a beer drinker, I can tell you some of it is really good. So I think they're reacting to this incentive. And of course, the tobacco companies are also adjusting their production mix to offer more of these e-cigarette vaping products.
So the zero alcohol beer would be taxed at a lower rate than the regular beer. That's interesting. To what extent do you think that these developing countries, emerging market countries, where generally you do have more smoking and more drinking and less taxation, what do you think is the potential in terms of raising their tax revenues in these countries by taxing these products?
No, I think they're never going to be the main revenue raiser, and they shouldn't be, because the tax base is too small. I would also, be wary about expanding it to every other harmful activity. And we talked only about these three, but you can argue that social media use is also harmful for you.
So it's a slippery slope. Is what you're saying.
Recently, I heard that in Mexico there is a tax on violent video games. I mean, you can do that. It's not going to raise a lot of revenue, and it may not be worth the administrative cost.
And so finally, in terms of international organizations, you are sitting in one right now. I mean, how do they fit into this? There's been a lot of effort in recent years to come up with fair international corporate tax policies. Can institutions like the IMF help with global tax policies that promote healthier living?
Yeah, I mean, just to step back and zoom out from the international financial institution, international organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, have focused on this for a while and have drawn attention to taxes being a possible instrument to steer people away from harmful habits. So that's happening. In terms of coordinating these tax rates across countries, that I think is not something for the international financial institutions to do. That's more for regional bodies. For example, in the European Union, there's now a draft tobacco directive that has 13 different categories of smoking products, and tries to set minimum rates so that they can somehow address some of the cross-border trade there. Or I think the African Union could also probably do something about the differentials in tax rates between those countries. Now, for an international financial institution like the IMF, I think there are two things. One is the IMF, as you know, provides a lot of technical assistance based on its 80 years of experience. They provide advice to the individual countries of how to design their tax regimes, drawing on all this experience. And that's one way they can help countries find the right mix there. And the other thing is what they have been doing is, especially specifically on these sin taxes, they have put out these so-called how-to notes. These how-to notes have been issued by our Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF for several years now on all kinds of issues. And there are how-to notes on sugar taxation, and tobacco taxation, and alcohol taxation. And obviously they are updated on a regular basis. So I think that's a great resource for policymakers to see what's the best practice and how can we implement this in our country.
Christoph Rosenberg is an economist and former deputy director in the communications department here at the IMF. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bruce. It was wonderful to talk to you.
Look for Christoph Rosenberg and Marius van Oort's article, Taxing Harmful Habits, in the March issue of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/F&D. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.